Welcome to the lecture, New Iconography of Women's Pro-Democracy Protest, Case Study of Belarus. Before we get to it, this is a recorded session. So by remaining and participating, you consent to being recorded, as both your video and your questions. Our speaker today is Tatiana. She is currently a master's student in European and Global Studies at the University of Padua, and a researcher at the European Union Politics SLC. Tatiana, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am really glad to present part of my broad research on democratization processes in Eastern Europe and women's empowerment in this region. And part of it is the new iconography of women's pro-democratic protest in Belarus. Here I will be focusing on the events that happened in Belarus in 2020, before and after the presidential elections, and the ongoing dynamics in the pro-democratic and anti-government movement, the symbols, the vocabulary, the language that they use to express their discontent over the regime and their political views. First, I'd like to say a couple of words. I think it is important on the motivation behind the research and how I came up with this. I first met a group of Belarusian activists, female activists, at an international event dedicated to academic freedom and human rights protection. I was presenting a case of some activities that me and my colleagues were conducting to help one Iranian case, and there was a group of Belarusian ladies, all of them students or professors or scholars, so all academia related, and they all were persecuted by their government. They were repressed, they were beaten up at protests. They were arrested, some of them in prison, some of them facing criminal charges, and eventually they were forced out of the country. And for me, it was quite shocking to see, because none of them remotely seemed like a violent person or raging anarchist or even radical feminist. None of them. They were women as young as 19 years old, and they were more mature women, but they were practically treated by their government as terrorists or extremists. Of course, it should not be a surprise, because Belarus has been known as the so-called last dictatorship of Europe for decades by now. But still, knowing the context of Belarusian society and knowing the Belarusian people, I was shocked to see and hear it firsthand, hear their experience firsthand. The important thing is that Belarusian society, like many post-Soviet societies, like certain Eastern European societies, is quite patriarchal on an overall level, while being matriarchal on micro level. And it's quite peaceful society. There is very low tolerance towards violence. It's not militarized or weaponized society like the US or Switzerland, for instance. So seeing women as a driving force of a huge, massive, unprecedented anti-government protest movement in this patriarchal context was unexpected, I would say. However, the fact that it was driven by women largely dictated certain conditions. Women are less violent during protests than men, and they have a certain toolkit, let's say, a certain instrument kit that they use to express their discontent with political situation or social situation. In this case, the rage over the lack of justice conducted by the regime of Aliaksandr Lukashenka. So I delved into research on this topic for my master's thesis and for my PhD proposal, and conducted over 100 interviews with female activists. Some of them were radical feminists, some of them were intersectional feminists. Some of them were just housewife, ordinary women who had no idea about feminism whatsoever. Talking to them, I managed to figure out the not just motivations that were behind their actions, but also the mechanisms of their self-expression, the tools that they were using, the tactics that they applied to protest and to fight with the regime the way they could, because many of them are quite limited in the instruments, being mothers, being wives, being the only breadwinner with children, and so on and so forth. It's a very, I would say, not narrowing down the instruments that you have to protest, but it gives you a certain speciality, let's say. So in this presentation, I will be covering really briefly the vocabulary that was used by the opposition and by the regime, which is very important because the opposition was reacting to the government rhetoric in their expression. The symbols that the opposition and the government were using, the imagery, and the artistic practices they were applying. Before that, or rather leading to that, it is necessary to understand the national context and the historic context of the women's-led opposition movement. Lukashenko's dictatorship has been in power for almost 3 decades by now. So, of course, there was the opposition movement, there were opposition groups, there was discontent, certain discontent, but never as massive and as widespread as the one in 2020, which was led by women. What changed? What was different by 2020? Well, probably one of the reasons is that the world changed, and one of the major trends was digitalization. So new opposition candidates, new opposition figures emerged that Lukashenko, Aliaksandr Lukashenko, the incumbent president, didn't have opportunity to catch on. So he was probably ignoring the global trends and looked over the emergence of those new figures. For instance, one of the leading opposition figures was a YouTube blogger, Sergei Tikhanovsky. He became popular after he launched his YouTube channel, who initially was a patriotic channel, just showing how the country was living, the situation in small towns and big cities, in agriculture, and so on and so forth. And with this digital instrument, he managed to gain a lot of visibility and thus support. And there were other candidates who managed to articulate their position, who managed to make themselves visible to the public, and the public saw them. In the run-up to the elections, all those opposition figures were either imprisoned or forced out of the country. All of them were male. As I said, one of the candidates was Sergei Tikhanovsky, who was imprisoned for false charges. And what happened after that was really unexpected by anyone, I guess. His wife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who you know probably if you are in the context of the politics of the region, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya took the signatures that were supposed to support her husband as a candidate. She basically managed to become a figure that united the opposition, despite the previous opposition figures were neutralized. So how did it happen? How did it happen? She, as you can see, this is her picture in 2020. She looks just like an average woman, and she is an average Belarusian woman. She is a housewife. She never participated in politics whatsoever. She lived probably happily with her husband. She is a mother. She is a former teacher of English language. But the electoral campaigns of three major candidates, managed to unite their efforts, managed to overcome any contradictions or disagreements that they have, which is unprecedented for 30 years of existence of independent Belarus, and present her as a united candidate of the opposition. And she was not alone. And here is where the very clear symbolism starts to be visible. So here you see three women who became the face of the ongoing, hopefully, revolution in Belarus. In the center, you see Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she became the representation of the majority, I dare to say, of Belarusian women. She is a traditional, a conservative woman, a mother. She also has a traditionally female occupation, traditionally female profession, traditional at least for Eastern Europe. She's a teacher. This is the most typical one for a woman. To her right, it's another woman, Veronika Tsepkala, and she represents another part of the population, both women and men. And the women are the majority of the population in Belarus. You should keep it in mind. So Veronika Tsepkala is a representation of the, let's say, new elite who get not in power politically, but economically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and during the new turmoil period. She is also a wife of another candidate who was not allowed to compete. And to the left of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is Maria Kolesnikova, and she represents a fairly small part of Belarusian women, but it's a very potent, very loud, visible, active part. She is an open feminist, and I'm saying open feminist as if it's something that you should hide, because we know that several years before the presidential elections, there were polls conducted in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine on the attitude of the population, both men and women, towards feminism and feminists, and the results were extremely negative. So the feminism has quite negative connotation in Belarus, maybe now a little bit less, but in the run-up to the elections, certainly. However, she was a feminist. She had strong ties with Europe. She worked with European countries. She worked a lot in Germany. She looks like a feminist in the eyes of an average person, I guess. In the patriarchal countries, she has short hair, bold red lip, which is one of the symbols of feminism. So she represented this part of the population who was Western-oriented and oriented towards modernization and reforms and so on and so forth. So these three women, no matter how different they are, with extremely different backgrounds, managed to unite their efforts and become the symbol of the new Belarus, or rather the hope for the new Belarus. And they also show in three signs, as you see, and those signs are drawn also behind them, which became also the symbol of their campaign. They are showing the peace sign, the fist, and the heart sign, which also refers to the main rhetoric of their campaign. So everything should be made without violence. There is no need for civil war or bloody revolution, but it should be persistent, should be strong, and it should be done with the care towards Belarusian people and with intention to make their life better. They were called three graces, which is interesting in terms of the historic artistic references, because it's reference to a very feminine image. And as you see, all of these women are quite feminine, traditionally feminine, should I say. What happened after they united their efforts and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya became the candidate? Her application was accepted, and she multiple times confirmed, as well as every single one of the activists that I talked to during my research, she didn't expect this, and nobody expected this, because well, the repression against opposition was already so strong, so people had hope, but not much. And every single one of them told me that probably Lukashenko allowed her to compete because she was a woman, and she, as a quite sexist man, could not even wrap his head around the fact that a woman can present a political threat. We will talk about his attitude towards Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and women's movement a little bit later on. So what happened after she submitted her application? She became a candidate, and the elections vote were counted. Nothing surprising happened. Incumbent President Lukashenko, who by that time was in power, I think, for 26 years already, declared a landslide victory with around 80% of the vote. And this is also very interesting because he chose the number that shows the overwhelming support for his leadership, which obviously at that time was not true, because at that time there were already massive rallies in support of Svetlana. Some of my interviewees shared the theory that if he invented a smaller number, if he have said that he gained, let's say, 53% and she gained 40%, the people would have agreed, because, well, they were not sure about her overwhelming support. But after he tried to convince himself and probably the rest of the world and the country that he has overwhelming support, which was not true, this provoked a lot of anger and the feeling of injustice. So the protest erupted. And as I said, Belarusian society is very peaceful. They are extremely respectful to the space they are protesting in, to the town, to the city, to other people's property. So they are not protesting violently, like, for instance, the French. It's French tradition, right, to protest in a very specific way. Belarusians are not like this. But the police responded in unproportionate way, in a very violent way. And what exacerbated the situation is that Lukashenko applied the biggest ever internet shutdown in history, because he shut down the internet on the territory of the entire country. So the entire nation was cut off the internet. And Belarus is not a super small country. It's about 9 million people, and the territory is quite big for a European country. So people were completely lost and disoriented, and they started to hear stories and reports about people being killed, protesters being injured. Then some people started to disappear, and they didn't contact their relatives or their friends. So people started panicking, and they went to the streets to find out what was happening. For 3 days, or should I say rather 3 nights, there was awful violence towards absolutely unarmed protesters. And as you see, as it happens in the majority of cases, the participants of violent protesters are men. So after 3 days, women went to the streets during daylight, and it was not organized, and it was not mobilized through any organization, because, as I said, even the internet was shut down. They went to the streets with flowers and a clear message. This woman holds a placard. She says, "It's my birthday today. I had a wish. So no more people got killed. We are peaceful people. Stop the violence, please." So see, it's a very respectful message, but it's also a very clear message. And this message became the symbol of the entire women's protest, which is, it is very important, because there are no complex discussions. There were no topics like gender rights, let's say, or LGBTQ community position in the society, or a discussion about economic reforms, this or that, or about anything that would be complex. But there was one clear message: stop the violence. And it was transmitted by women who in traditionalist Belarusian society are the most logical barriers of this message of peace, love, of caregiving, and so on and so forth. This is how women's marches started. Of course, there were then all national rallies, not only women's. There were rallies and marches of different professions, for instance, or there were also LGBTQ columns. There were marches of doctors, of teachers, and so on, but they were under the umbrella of this women-led opposition. It is very interesting because Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was pushed out of the country very soon after the elections, and she confirmed later on that the safety of her children was compromised. So she left, and she recorded a video message, which later was well, there were speculations that she was forced to do this, and that, according probably to Lukashenko's logic, should have calmed down the protests, because the only leader that they had, the only surviving and remaining leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, left the country. But this didn't prevent them from marching against and supporting Svetlana, because again, as a woman, she's allowed to be weak, because women are still called weaker sex in Eastern Europe, right? So it was understandable. Her behavior was understandable. She was protecting her children. She was protecting her life. She's a woman. She's a mother. She doesn't have to fight the police officers in a fist fight. And there was a huge difference in the imagery of the government and anti-government protests, as you see. Anti-government female protesters were using flowers, dresses, and peace signs and everything like this, while Lukashenko was using the traditional, for him, image of a masculine man in a uniform. Lukashenko has been exploiting the image of a hyper-masculine man since the very beginning of his presidency, and since the very first presidential campaign that he ran. At that time, he was a young politician, and he even addressed his voters. The majority of him were women at that time, and even before the events of 2020, the majority of his audience, his support platform, were women. So at that time, he referred to them as a young man, even with a playful, sexually oriented, let's say, language about a young man who is more capable than old, decaying communist Soviets party nomenclatura leaders who were not capable of anything. So 30 years after, he was using the same image of a strong man, of a strong hand, presented as a strong leader who cares about the nation. However, this image of him being the protector of the nation, a real man who has to protect the nation, was shaken. Because what he was doing in 2020 after the elections was not exactly protecting, but rather attacking. So instead of being the real man, he became the abusive man of the nation. And I am referring to the nation as a partner in the family, because this is how in both the governmental rhetoric and often in the opposition rhetoric, the Belarus, the country, was seen. Lukashenko also used a lot of sexist and pejorative language towards Svetlana Tikhanovskaya personally and towards women who were supporting her on the streets. So he launched a campaign which slogan was "Любимый не отдает," which can be translated as "You don't give up on the loved ones." So you don't give up a woman that you love to someone else who is trying to seduce and steal her, as if Belarus was a person, a woman, a partner who was being stolen by some other man, apparently. And he launched a huge campaign, the artistic campaigns. There were concerts, there were also artistic support for this from loyal singers and music bands and so on and so forth, and actors. He also used a lot of traditionalist conservative sexist language directly. These are direct quotes, sort of that women's place is the kitchen, that Tikhanovskaya should go back to the kitchen and fry her cutlets. This became completely viral across Belarus and also in Russia and Ukraine, everywhere, Russian-speaking countries. And he also claimed that the Belarusian constitution is not designed for a woman because women are not capable, according to him, to deal with politics and to keep the burden of caring about the nation, and only a man can do this, and certainly not Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. After months of a protest, and then sometime after that, as Svetlana Tikhanovskaya not only remained the leader of the opposition, but also became recognized by European countries as a legal representative of Belarusian people, he resorted to the instrument which is often used against women who are believed to be strong, the hint to adultery, the hint that she was cheating on her husband, who was in Lukashenko's prison in Belarus, with her Western partners or sponsors or whoever you would like to imagine. So this is a very traditional sexist rhetoric that he was using towards Svetlana personally and women protesting in general. And talking with the activists, I noticed one thing, that many of them said that before 2020, they never actually paid attention to what he was saying. It was like listening to an old man saying old fairy tales or nonsenses, and you just ignore it because there is no point to argue with him. The problem is that he's not just an old man; he's a president of the country with a monopoly on the army and the police forces. So before 2020, women tended to ignore this attitude and this language towards them. But in 2020, when they got the visual representation of themselves and being directly offended by the president, who used to be the image of protection and the father of the nation, was a different game. So they changed the attitude and became really offended by his rhetoric. The opposition also used a lot of gender terminology and symbols. As I said at the beginning, after the 3 days of violence, women went to the streets wearing flowers and white dresses. And in general, white and red became the colors of the revolution because it's the color of the flag that the opposition uses instead of the now official flag of Belarus. So they were wearing white dresses or just white clothes with red elements, red flowers, red lips, makeup. They were also using lingerie, red and white lingerie, like holding them as placards or showing them, for instance, on the balconies and the windows. Just like a symbol of the colors that they support, referring to the fact and to the idea that men are would be ashamed to touch the women's lingerie openly or something like that. So they were using very traditionally feminine images, and the sign that you are seeing says Belarus is she. I voted for her. So just like Lukashenko was referring to Belarus as a woman who he allegedly wanted to protect from her stupidity, which leads her to into the hands of deceiving other forces. Opposition also referred to Belarus as she, obviously making a reference to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So here, after years of Lukashenko's efforts to equal himself with the country, just like many dictators and authoritarian leaders do, and thus disagreement with discontent over the leader would equal the same for the nation, the opposition was detaching themselves and the country from the masculine image of Lukashenko to the feminine image of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The opposition was also using a lot of sexualized language, some of them quite explicit as a language. It was a sort of creative reappropriation, I would say, just like the N-word, for instance, it's one of the brightest examples, right? But here it was the same tendency. Lukashenko loved to say that those who participate in the protests are drug addicts and prostitutes, because who else would protest against his regime? Only prostitutes. So women were reappropriating this pejorative language towards them. And the placard of this woman says, this is a march of unsatisfied women unsatisfied with a dictatorship. Again, it's another sexually related language that they were using. I would say that this can be classified as an example of détournement. Détournement was initially, of course, used for instrumentalizing the expressions of the capitalist system and the media culture against them. But here we see women instrumentalizing the rhetoric and the language of the government towards them to use against them. And through presenting themselves as peacekeeping caregivers who were asking just for peace, they were weaponizing the traditionalist rhetoric around women and the traditional role of women in the society and in the government. Another important part of the terminology and symbols that the opposition was using were recognizable symbols. Maybe not for everyone in the audience, these symbols are 100% recognizable, but for instance, the image that the young lady is holding with Maria Kolesnikova in a red dress, this is an extremely recognizable symbol in post-Soviet countries. It refers to Soviet placards during the Nazi invasion, which says the motherland is calling. So the motherland is calling to protect, right? And here it is the same image saying the motherland is calling Maria, meaning Maria Kolesnikova. It goes really well because it sounds similar. It's Rodina Mать зовет for the Soviet placard and Rodina Mash зовет for the current Belarusian placard. So everyone who lives or who has any roots in Eastern Europe, or maybe also abroad, recognize this symbol immediately and reappropriating the symbol for the just cause, because the cause of using this placard 70 years ago was just, right? It was to defend against the Nazis. So it draws the historic parallel with the fight against Lukashenko's regime in 2020 and furthermore. And here is another instrumentalization of symbols. This symbol is recognizable rather on the territory of Belarus. The man, the horseman on the red field is one of the oldest coat of arms in Europe, and it was used by independent Belarus in 1918 for a year, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, before Lukashenko came to power. So this is recognizable for Belarusian people. And as you see, the women-led pro-democratic movement instrumentalized another reconceptualized image, a horse woman, right, on the same horse with the same swords. So just rethinking this concept to illustrate the change of the trend, the change of the reality. And finally, I'm sorry for the graphic image, but this is a piece of art. It's a painting. This is a part of artistic practices that were implemented by the opposition. They were extremely creative, as I said. This is a painting drawn after the most violent days, after the violent crackdown on the opposition, on the protesters, and actually on peaceful participants of the marches. This is a Belarusian Venus, drawn by a Belarusian artist, female artist. It implies classic femininity references, right? Venus is a classic femininity image, and Venus is very powerful, and she doesn't need the weapons to be powerful. But it also brings up the national political context. She's lying on material, probably on the flag of the new opposition movement, white, red, white. She's hugging it, and she's beaten up by the regime, right? So this is a very clear message. It's very moving image, and it's again recognizable because it is within the framework of recognizable femininity symbols. The protesters were also using a lot of different techniques, especially after the repressions against the opposition became omnipresent, and it was impossible to go out together in big marches, on big squares. It happened gradually, but eventually now it is impossible to even get together in a group of 5 on the street. Unfortunately, they applied a lot the rhetoric that is known as "be water" from Hong Kong protesters. It means be this force that is never concentrated, or which is not led by a single leader, but rather is everywhere. And the second when the police or other enforcement is coming, you're just disappearing. You're just dispersing yourself. That's how Belarusian protesters were acting a lot. So also they were using invisible protest. Invisible in meaning that it's not about a flag or a placard with a political slogan, but rather different hints that would let another person who supports you to understand what you mean. This could be, and I see it a lot on Belarusian activists, and Belarusian people, just not activists, just people who live here in Europe, also here in Italy, who are wearing the nails, white and red nails all the time, including men, just to let others know that they are not alone, that they are still here. And I'm putting the sneakers here because the red and white sneakers was on a person, became a reason for this person to be arrested. Because these are the colors of the opposition. So even the combination of these colors could be dangerous for a person to wear, but it still can be a message. And the last form of a new protest that the Belarusian opposition was using that I would like to talk about is hashtag activism. Women who are the majority of the users of Instagram in Eastern Europe, it works also for Russia, for instance, they are the majority. So they feel like home on Instagram and in social media. They were using a lot of hashtag activism and hashtag campaigns, online campaigns, to support other people, to collect money, let's say, for those who were arrested and fined. And also, since it became practically impossible to keep political science anywhere, women would come to certain places, install political signs or figures or whatever artistic installation they had, took photo and then spread it anonymously via social media, not only Instagram, but also Telegram and whatever social media they had. So as you see, the instruments that they were using was extremely varied. So coming to the conclusions, the consequences of all these techniques that they were using and the particularity in which they managed to organize themselves and solidarize themselves led that the consequences became striking, actually. I presented here the quotes from the ladies I talked to, the quotes that, to my mind, express very well what was happening and what has been happening in the mind of women who were protesting for the political cause in the patriarchal society and country. First, it's that this protest is not 100% feminist. So a lot of headlines in the Western media saying that it's a feminist revolution are not exactly true. It's not feminist, it's women's. So women rejected the idea of staying in the kitchen and staying silent while the life of the government, of the nation, of the society was being decided by a man, one single man. But on the other hand, it used a lot of traditional elements of the image of a woman, her position in the society, the association with peace, with beauty, with life, and so on. It was an interesting mix indeed, as one of my respondents said. Another important conclusion here is that women managed to instrumentalize the patriarchal order and benefit from it. So they appropriated the images of weakness of women, the image of women as feeble creatures who ask for attention of men, and they managed to take this image and to use it or weaponize it against the oppressive male-dominated regime. And another very important conclusion to me is that Lukashenko's misogyny and the misogyny of his administration, apparently, no matter if his administration consists of men and women, the misogyny of his regime backfired. Because he never thought, he never could even imagine that a woman could present a threat, especially a political threat, to him, while he was enjoying the support from the female population for decades, literally. And that's when he made a mistake and let women take the lead. Thank you very much. I hope you have questions, and I'm really glad to answer any of them.
Thank you for the presentation. It was a very interesting topic, and we're still waiting what is going to happen, to see what is going to happen in Belarus. We don't hear much about the situation these days. Do we have any questions to start with? Yes, please, Mahim.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana. First of all, it was a great presentation and really eye-opening, so kudos to you. I think my question, as I'm very much interested in what caused this kind of like pivotal shift in gender being kind of like a mobilizing issue when women kind of like rising up against the government, and why did it not happen previously, but kind of like mobilized politics right now, which is the question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Actually, this is one of the research questions for my proposal. What I understand right now is that before that, women became part of the politically passive electorate, just like they are in many regimes, not only authoritarian ones. Women are seen as non-political creatures. They are the ones responsible for children, for future generations, for the house, and so on and so forth, but not with serious issues, right, like the politics. However, women can mobilize themselves on the basis of being women, right? On the features that are inherent for women. We have seen examples of women mobilizing as mothers. For instance, in Russia, they were mobilizing as mothers of the soldiers. Also, in Southern America countries, women were mobilizing against the dictatorships as mothers because they were caring about the children and the future of their children, or wives because they were caring about the future or the lives of their husbands. So they can mobilize, however, not that much around political issues, especially in authoritarian regimes where there is no feminist agenda. So women do not speak up for themselves. So you wouldn't expect Belarusian women in a conservative society that they would massively speak up for gender rights, right? Despite the fact that they have been discriminated to the unprecedented level, unbelievable, actually. But when there was a threat to the society and threat to the country from the regime, women who the society and many of them themselves, they saw themselves as responsible for other people. But first of all, they felt responsible for their men. What happened after the revolution, the election, sorry? After the elections, men who were participating in the protests were beaten up, were tortured. Some of them got killed. Some of them were in unknown locations. And women went to the prisons. They went to the police stations. They went to the streets to demand justice for their men, to demand to release their men. And many of my respondents were saying that they went to the street because they didn't want to let their men go, because they knew that the man would be beaten up severely, maybe got killed, definitely got arrested, and maybe imprisoned for God knows how many years. So they would insist to make their men stay at home and go outside. Because again, another stereotype that exists in, at least in Eastern Europe, is that girls are not get beaten up. Девочек не бьют. So they don't beat the girls, which is not true, by the way. It's not true neither on a family level, on societal level, or on political level, but this is a stereotype. So many of them went to the street hoping that the police, who are mainly men, right, would not dare to beat a woman, especially a young woman, like a teenager, or an elderly woman, any woman, right? It's unacceptable in their mind. And for a certain time, it was true. For a certain time, women got a lot less negative attention from the police. So they would insist for their men to stay in safety and take the risk on themselves, because they saw themselves as caregivers and protectors, those who cared for the family, and as an extended version of the family to the society. It's a very complex and complicated motivation behind this, but it's rarely the feminist motivation, to stand up for yourself. It's rather traditionalist motivations to stand up for others as a woman who sacrifices everything that she has for others. This is a traditional role of women. I'm not saying that all Belarusian women had this motivation. Many of them, especially young ones, had a rather feminist lens on it. But this was overwhelming feeling, I would say. Does it make any sense? Did I respond to your question?
Yeah, I think I got the inherent reason behind that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one detail about caring for the society, is that there was one factor that now we often miss, is that in 2020 there was COVID raging on the planet, but Lukashenko's regime was completely ignoring the existence of COVID. And Lukashenko, the president himself, was the biggest COVID dissident. He just denied the existence of the virus. So since he denied the existence of the virus, he didn't provide any help for hospitals, for medical care. So people had to organize and solidarize themselves to buy medications, to provide doctors with some basic materials, to bring them food, because they had to work overtime. And again, this is a motivation of solidarization, which is based on caring and protecting, right? Something that women are very naturally in these societies inclined to, or believed to be inclined to. Because this was sort of a continuation of this logic of the society being disillusioned in their leader, who claimed to be their protector and the father, and then all of this going into the rise of women's figures as leading figures, and then leading to the final complete disillusionment and complete loss of image of the father of the nation who protects you, and transforming Lukashenko into the abuser of the nation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any of the questions that we have? If not, I have one. I think I've asked you before. when we talk about women in politics, we often see them as an alternative to men, exclusively, I think, as an alternative to men. And that goes, I believe, with projecting or presenting stereotypically female traits and qualities. Like women are more empathetic, women are more caring, women, they will do a better job at managing, let's say, the country, because women have been managing the household for centuries and all of that, which I'm personally quite allergic to as a concept. Because I believe that this image of the caring and nice and empathetic woman is what we tend to see in quite a few female politicians. So my question linked to how Belarusian women started protesting as a means to free their husbands or their sons or their brothers from regime suppression, is how do you believe that we can get away from these stereotypes, and how can we stop presenting women politicians as just an alternative to men?
That's an amazing question. Well, first of all, there is a certain truth in the fact that women are less violent than men. Men are statistically more violent. You can count it in the statistics of violent crimes that are committed by men and women, and the population of prisons and like what they were imprisoned for. It's hard to say whether all of this violence was socially constructed from men and why women are less violent. But this is at least one thing, that women are definitely less violent. The question is whether they are less violent in politics. Well, we don't see that. We don't see that whatsoever. Belarus is a very interesting case indeed for this speculation, let's say, for thinking about this. Because despite being quite low on gender equality index, Belarus showing surprisingly high ranking in political empowerment part of it, because women take huge part of administration and lower bureaucracy level. So there are a lot of women, way more women in parliament, for instance, than you would see in major European countries, for instance. And these women are not promoting any alternative agenda. They are completely loyal to the government. I think this comes from the fact that women are oppressed by the men, and many of them want to be on the side of the strong one, do not want to have problems, and they want to be protected, and thus they side with the strong one and work for in this case, for instance, for Lukashenko's administration. And plus, since politics do not exist, right, there is no political competition, so it's not very privileged to be part of the political class, actually, because you don't gain anything, you don't get any real power. So women can be there. Men rather do business or be occupied on some other fields where they can get money or influence. So women are allowed, let's say, there in Belarus. However, they do not present anything alternative to Lukashenko. The thing is that in Belarus, women became so powerful as opposition leaders, not because they were women and they presented their political agenda. No, Belarus had candidates, all of them were male, who were very popular. And they were popular because of their political agenda and whatever they were suggesting to the population. Women were the last resort, let's say, of the Belarusian society, when men were incapable to do anything. That's how many women perceive in Belarus, because like men failed. So, okay, it's time for women who before were responsible for families, for the house, for the elderly, for the emotional support, for emotional intelligence, for the children, for the education of the children, and everything. And now, when male failed, the only task that they have, the politics, women had to take it in their hands. So this is how it often perceived. I don't have recipes on how to overcome the stereotype that women are alternative to men, and women have natural inclination to certain policies, because they definitely do not. However, many women instrumentalize this in politics. So many women, probably not having hope to compete on the same ground as men, monopolize certain grounds at least to get into politics. So they maybe don't become the presidents yet, but they can monopolize the sphere of education or the healthcare, and then maybe spread their like the right of a woman to exist in other spheres like finance, which is very interesting, for instance, in case of Russia, because finance, economy in general in Soviet Union used to be non-existent science, and it was not privileged whatsoever. It was something quite low level. So women occupied this field completely. And now the head of the financial sphere in Russia is a woman, because it's a continuation of a tradition of letting women in, and then this sphere becomes very important, and women are already there, and they are the best in the sphere, and they dominate in the sphere. So maybe it is one of the ways to be water, you know, like the strategy of Hong Kong and the Belarusian protests. Don't clash directly with a force that now is stronger than you are, but try to penetrate into the weak places of this force, like the places that it doesn't control, the places where it doesn't see, and then undermine this force from within, or from the angles, from the directions this force doesn't expect you. So it's a very philosophical question. It's a very complex one. I'm not hoping to see it in our lifetime to be resolved. But I tend to believe that the fact that women instrumentalized it and society sees this like this, women being alternative to men and women occupying certain policies, as a step towards the right direction still. I'm not negative about this, but I understand how bitter this logic is, and how it is unpleasant to hear this once again, these stereotypes being fed to the population and instrumentalized by the politicians.
Great, thank you very much for answering the question. Do we have any other questions for Tatiana at this stage? I will be taking that as a no. Tatiana, thank you very much for your presentation and for your insights in the situation in Belarus.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Great work.